Parents kick their son out on his birthday. A couple of days later, their electricity, water, and communications were cut off. What he did shocked everyone. Subscribe so you don't miss the next stories. Write in the comments, which city are you from? The street lights flickered above as Marcus turned into the cracked driveway, the tires of his aging sedan crunching softly over loose gravel. The sky above Ridgeway, Ohio, was a dull slate blue, the last streaks of daylight swallowed by the creeping autumn dusk. He sat still for a moment in the driver's seat, the engine idling low. His fingers tapped absent-mindedly on the steering wheel, eyes resting on the dim outline of the house he had called home for most of his life. The porch light wasn't on. It hadn't been for a long time. He knew better than to expect anything, but still, some stubborn thread deep inside him tugged at his ribs. 30. A milestone. A quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, something would be different this time. On the passenger seat beside him sat a small plastic cake box, the kind sold at the front of the grocery store for lonely holidays and half-hearted celebrations. The cake inside was frosted in plain white, with the words "Happy Birthday" scrawled in uneven red icing. He hadn't corrected the teenager behind the counter when she misspelled his name. Mark instead of Marcus, because it didn't matter. No one would see it but him. He turned off the ignition and stepped out, pulling his jacket tighter around his shoulders. The autumn wind bit sharply through the thin fabric, and he hunched instinctively. The house loomed quietly in front of him, familiar and exhausted. Paint peeled from the siding, one of the gutters hung crooked, and a porch step creaked ominously under his weight as he climbed it. Still, it was home. Or it had been. Inside, the air was still, cold in a way that suggested no one had turned the heat on. The kitchen light was the only one glowing, casting everything in a harsh, yellow hue. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him gently. The smell of canned vegetables and meatloaf hit him first. It was the same dinner they always had on Wednesdays. There was no sound beyond the faint clink of utensils and the hum of the refrigerator. Walter, his father, sat at the head of the table, hunched over his plate. His mother, Louise, was to his right, her posture stiff, gaze locked on her food. Neither of them looked up. The silence had always been part of the atmosphere in this house, tight-lipped, heavy, unwelcoming. Marcus set the cake down on the counter, the plastic bag crackling louder than he intended. He waited. No acknowledgement. No glance. He moved toward the hallway to hang his coat when Walter's voice sliced through the silence. "You're late." Marcus paused, turning back slightly. "Had to stay late at the shop," he said evenly. "End of month work orders." Walter grunted, poured another shot of cheap whiskey into a chipped glass, and didn't respond. Louise didn't look up. She stirred at her green beans with unnecessary force, as if the rhythm of the movement offered protection from interaction. Marcus let out a breath and took his seat at the table, the old chair creaking beneath him. Dinner proceeded in mechanical fashion, knives scraping plates, teeth chewing, glasses clinking. No conversation. Certainly no celebration. Marcus poked at his mashed potatoes, pushing them into a sad hill. He had long since stopped expecting gestures or warmth, but something about the sheer emptiness of the evening sat wrong in his chest. There was no mention of his birthday, not even a sarcastic one. Just silence. Halfway through the meal, Walter's fork hit the plate with a sharp clang. Louise jumped slightly, then went back to pretending not to exist. Walter leaned back in his chair, looking at Marcus like he was a roach that had overstayed its welcome. "You're too old to be freeloading," he said, his voice steady and cold, too calculated to be spontaneous. "It's time you left." The words didn't register at first. Marcus blinked, unsure he heard correctly. His eyes went to his mother instinctively, searching for contradiction, for resistance, for anything. She didn't look up. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, pale and bloodless. "I pay the electricity," Marcus replied quietly. "The internet. Half the mortgage." Walter let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Paying a few bills doesn't mean you get to live here forever, Princess." The nickname landed like a punch to the gut. Princess. He hadn't heard that since he was a child, 7 or 8 years old, running into Walter's lap with scraped knees and a heart full of belief that dads were supposed to be proud. Now it was weaponized. A sneer, a mockery. He looked down at his plate, then at the cheap birthday cake on the counter. The moment crystallized into something sharp. This wasn't a spontaneous outburst. This was planned. This was the moment they had chosen to sever ties. On his birthday. He stood slowly, the chair legs screeching faintly against the linoleum. Neither parent reacted. They had made up their minds. "Got it," he said quietly. Walter smirked, poured another drink. Louise kept her head bowed. The slumped curve of her shoulders betrayed something like shame, but not enough to stop what was happening. Marcus turned and walked out of the room. Each step felt louder than it should have, echoing across the house like footsteps in a mausoleum. When he passed the kitchen counter, he paused briefly. The cake sat lopsided in the plastic box, the red icing smeared slightly from the drive. One of the candles was missing. Maybe it had fallen in the car. Maybe it had never been there at all. Upstairs, his room looked the same as always, cramped, dated, his own only in theory. The wallpaper was peeling in one corner. His bed sagged slightly in the middle. The ceiling fan made a faint clicking noise whenever it turned. He sat on the edge of the mattress, staring at the packed bag he'd kept half hidden in the closet for weeks. Deep down, some part of him had known this was coming. He stood and removed his jacket, folding it carefully over the suitcase. His movements were methodical, steady, not because he wasn't hurt, but because he was done pretending, done hoping they would see him, done accepting the role of silent provider, done believing that love in this house was anything but conditional. He moved around the room, gathering the essentials: wallet, keys, passport, insurance papers. As he zipped the suitcase closed, the sound felt final, irrevocable. Outside his window, the wind picked up, rustling the bare branches of the maple trees that lined the street. Another reminder that winter was near. But this year, for the first time in his life, he wouldn't be here when it hit. He sat again, the suitcase by his feet, and glanced at the cake still sitting on the nightstand. Its lopsided, childish decorations now seemed absurd, an echo of a hope long gone. Without thinking, he pushed it off the edge. The box crumpled against the carpet with a soft, anticlimactic thud. Frosting leaked onto the fibers like a wound. "Happy birthday, Marcus." He leaned back, pressing his palms into his eyes until stars flared behind his lids. Sadness was there, yes, but it was cooler now, not the fiery grief of betrayal, but the cold, hard edge of something stronger. Resolve. The house creaked around him, old floorboards groaning with age. Downstairs he could hear the television buzzing, some laugh-track sitcom echoing mindlessly through the living room. Life went on as if nothing had changed, as if tonight hadn't been a quiet, calculated execution of whatever remained between them. Maybe it had never been a home. Maybe it had just been a place where he paid rent with his soul. He stood, grabbed his phone, and walked out of the room, the suitcase in tow. He moved quietly down the stairs out of habit. In the living room, Walter slouched in his recliner, beer in hand, eyes glazed. Louise perched on the edge of the couch, her face pinched and unreadable. Neither looked up. He stood in the doorway, waiting. For what, he wasn't sure. Maybe for one of them to say something, anything. But there was only silence. Walter noticed him first. He raised his can lazily, his lips curling. "Don't forget to turn off the lights when you leave," he slurred. "You're not paying for them anymore." Marcus didn't reply. He didn't shout or cry. He didn't ask why. He just let the silence wrap around him like a closing door. Then he turned and walked back up the stairs, each step heavier than the last. At the top, he paused, placing his palm flat against the bedroom door. The wood was cold under his touch. It felt like a farewell, not just to a room or a house, but to an entire life. He whispered to himself, barely audible in the stillness, "Tomorrow, I'll leave." And this time he meant it. The house was silent as Marcus lay awake in the darkness, the faint buzz of the television downstairs now replaced by the steady creaks and sighs of old wood settling. Outside his window, wind rustled through the brittle leaves, and every so often a gust would rattle the pane. He stared at the ceiling, the outline of the old fan casting long shadows that turned slowly in the moonlight. The cake box still lay on the carpet where it had fallen, smashed and forgotten, like the boy he used to be who believed birthdays meant something in this house. His thoughts moved like water, slow and unstoppable. He hadn't turned on the light, didn't need to. He knew this room by heart, the drawer that stuck, the floorboard near the closet that always groaned, the crack in the window frame that let cold air in each November. This was his room, but it had never been his space. Not really. It had always belonged to someone else's expectations. Lying there, fully dressed, his jacket folded neatly on the suitcase beside him, Marcus felt the pressure building in his chest. Not panic, no, that had come and gone, but something denser. Resignation. Release. The idea of leaving had hovered in his mind for years like a low-hanging storm cloud. But now, finally, the rain had come, and he wasn't going to wait around to drown in it. He sat up slowly and reached under the bed for his laptop. The familiar weight of it grounded him. He opened it with steady hands, the glow from the screen throwing pale light across his face. He hadn't planned for this moment. Not exactly, but he had always known it might come. That quiet voice inside, the one he'd ignored for so long, had been right all along. Family should never feel like debt. The cursor blinked on the home page of the electric company's website. His username auto-filled. He didn't hesitate. For years he had managed the bills because they were always too busy, too tired, not good with technology. He had been the one to set up the online portals, to monitor due dates, to link his checking account for auto-pay. It was all in his name. He navigated to the account settings and stared at the Remove Payment Method button for a moment. Then, with a slow exhale, he clicked. The confirmation message flashed. Payment method removed. Service will terminate at the end of the billing cycle. He didn't blink. The water bill came next, then gas, internet, cable. Each screen was a familiar landscape, his name and information displayed at the top, a quiet reminder of how deeply embedded he had been in keeping this household alive. Click by click, he severed ties. Each confirmation felt like a string cut, another weight lifted. His mind drifted as he worked. Images surfaced, unwelcome, unshakable. The winter 2 years ago when the furnace died and Louise had called him at work in a panic. He'd left early, driven through ice to get there before the pipes froze, spent the night in a freezing crawl space trying to thaw the lines with a hairdryer. Walter hadn't even gotten off the couch. Then the summer the roof had started leaking. Contractors were too expensive, Walter had said, so Marcus bought shingles, borrowed a ladder from the neighbor, and spent 3 Saturdays patching the holes himself. He still had the sunburned scars. Even smaller moments resurfaced, stabbing him unexpectedly. The grocery runs after long shifts. The way his mother had handed him her credit card bill each month like it was his obligation. The time she'd crashed her car and he'd drained his vacation fund to pay for repairs. Not a thank you. Not even a sorry. He closed the browser and sat back in the chair, staring into the soft blue light. The silence of the house pressed in on him again, but it felt different now. Less suffocating, more like space. His phone vibrated. A text from Nora. "You okay?" He didn't answer. Not yet. Not until he was gone. He moved around the room quietly, gathering what little he needed. The suitcase was already half packed, an act of subconscious preparation he hadn't fully admitted to until now. He added a folder with important documents: birth certificate, car title, employment records. His Social Security card was still in his wallet. Everything he needed to start over. Before zipping the bag shut, he added a plain black hoodie and a pair of work jeans. His uniform, his armor. Then he reached for a small fireproof box on the top shelf of the closet, one most people would use for valuables. Inside were the only things that felt worth protecting: a worn photograph of him and his grandmother on the front porch, his high school diploma, a small notebook filled with sketches and ideas for the auto shop he once dreamed of opening. He tucked it into the bag. Outside, the wind had picked up. Tree branches scraped lightly against the siding. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once and fell silent. It was nearly 2 a.m. He sat again on the edge of the bed and glanced once more at the ruined cake on the floor. A smear of frosting caught the light, red icing bleeding into the beige carpet. It looked ridiculous now, pathetic even, a symbol of a day that had meant nothing to anyone but him. But instead of sadness, he felt a kind of numb clarity. He opened a second browser window and logged into his bank. The shared savings account sat near the top of the screen. It had been opened years ago, back when Louise insisted they should all have access in case of family emergencies. He had put in almost every dollar. They had withdrawn nearly half. He tapped the screen, selected Freeze Account. No withdrawals, no transfers. It would take weeks of paperwork and in-person verification to unfreeze it. Long enough for him to be long gone. He smiled grimly and clicked Confirm. Next, he checked his auto insurance. Both vehicles, Walter's truck and Louise's Camry, were under his plan. He had bundled them to save them money, back when things still felt like sacrifices worth making. He clicked through the removal process, deleting both vehicles from the policy. Another confirmation. Finally, he updated his direct deposit information with his job, routing future paychecks to a new account he had quietly opened 2 months ago. The same voice that had packed that suitcase had whispered this into his ear too, just in case. He sat back. The room looked the same, but everything had changed. The house had always needed him. That had been the truth behind the illusion. His presence had been their convenience. His absence would be their collapse. Downstairs, the faint clink of a bottle against a counter broke the silence. He imagined Walter stumbling into the kitchen looking for another drink. Maybe tomorrow morning he'd try to microwave coffee and wonder why the power was out. Maybe he'd scream at Louise. Maybe he'd call Marcus again, demand answers, demand help. But there would be no answer. The phone buzzed again. Another message from Nora. "I'm up. If you need to crash here tonight, you can." He stared at the screen for a moment, then typed back, "Leaving now. We'll be there in 20. He zipped the suitcase closed with a final tug and stood. He looked around the room once, letting his eyes move across the shelves, the worn carpet, the posters on the wall that hadn't been touched since college. It looked like a museum exhibit now. A frozen snapshot of a life spent waiting for approval that would never come. He turned off the laptop, grabbed his phone, and carried his things downstairs. The living room was dark now, save for the pale blue light of the television still playing to an empty room. Walter was asleep in the recliner, mouth open slightly, beer can resting precariously on his chest. Louise wasn't in sight. He didn't linger. He didn't say goodbye. Outside, the air was colder than before, sharp and clean. He wheeled the suitcase to the car parked 2 blocks away, hidden behind a neighbor's hedge. It wasn't about secrecy. It was about control. He hadn't wanted Walter to see the loaded trunk and decide to pick a final fight. The car started on the first try. Marcus sat behind the wheel for a moment, the dashboard lights casting a soft glow on his hands. Then he put the car in gear and pulled away from the curb, the house disappearing behind him, swallowed by the darkness. He didn't cry. He didn't look back. Ahead, the road stretched long and empty. The horizon was beginning to lighten, just barely. And somewhere beyond that horizon, a new life was waiting. The world was still when Marcus parked in front of Nora's building just before dawn. The streets of Ridgeway were quiet, the air thick with the final breath of night. Fog rolled low along the asphalt, and in the distance porch lights flickered on one by one like reluctant stars. He sat behind the wheel for a few moments, longer than necessary, watching the condensation bead on the windshield as his thoughts unraveled slowly. He hadn't spoken a word since leaving his parents' house. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was necessary. He had spent too many years filling silence with explanations, apologies, reassurances no one had asked for, but everyone had demanded. Now, he let the quiet stretch. Let it sit. Nora was already waiting in the doorway, arms folded against the morning chill. She wore sweatpants and a hoodie, her hair pulled into a loose bun. When Marcus stepped out of the car, she didn't ask questions. She just took the handle of his suitcase and walked him upstairs. The apartment was small, cozy in the way old buildings tend to be. Hardwood floors creaked underfoot, and a lavender candle flickered faintly on the windowsill. He set his duffel bag beside the couch and sank into it heavily. She handed him a blanket and a mug of hot water with lemon, her version of comfort. "Crash," she said softly. "We'll talk when you're ready." He nodded, grateful. Within minutes, he was asleep. When he woke again, the sun had climbed well into the sky, casting warm light across the wooden floorboards. The apartment smelled like toast and cinnamon. Nora was nowhere in sight, but a note on the table read, "Went to clinic. Be back by 3. Rest." He looked at the clock. It was nearly noon. His phone, resting face down beside the couch, was already vibrating. He picked it up slowly, knowing exactly what he'd find. 13 missed calls, 5 voicemails, 2 texts from Walter, all caps, 1 from Louise, the rest from unfamiliar numbers, likely relatives. The voicemails played like a slow-motion car crash. The first was Walter, his voice slurred and angry. "You think you can just walk out after everything we did for you? Ungrateful little—" The message cut off. The second was calmer, Louise's voice tight with what passed for maternal concern. "Marcus, please call us. You're making a mistake. This isn't you. We just want to talk. Please don't do anything drastic." The third was another from Walter, this time louder. "You're gonna regret this. You hear me? We gave you everything. Everything. And this is how you repay us?" He stopped listening after that. The texts weren't much better. One read, "Can't believe you'd abandon your own mother." Another, "Whatever's going on, it's no reason to cut your family off like this." Then came the one that made his stomach turn, a Facebook screenshot from a mutual friend with a message underneath. "Hey, you okay?" He clicked the link. There, posted to the Ridgeway Community Bulletin group, was a photo of Walter and Louise standing on their porch, bundled in jackets looking somber. The caption read, "Some daughters are raised to be grateful. Some sons grow up selfish. Ours left us cold, hungry, and alone on his birthday. Pray for us." The post had dozens of reactions already, sad emojis, prayers, comments of support, and then the ones that twisted the knife deeper. Strangers writing things like, "Kids these days have no respect," or "Entitled millennials living rent-free and still think they're victims." He stared at the screen until the letters blurred. Then he placed the phone face down again. The next hour passed in a haze of disbelief. He cleaned the kitchen without thinking, washed the dishes Nora had left in the sink, swept the floor. His hands needed something to do. His mind circled like a vulture. The betrayal wasn't just personal now, it was public. They hadn't been content to kick him out. Now they were rewriting the story to paint themselves as victims and him as the villain. When Nora returned, she didn't say anything. She placed a brown paper bag of groceries on the counter, glanced at him with quiet understanding, and only asked, "You see it?" He nodded. "You want to talk about it?" "Not yet." She gave a small nod and went to put the groceries away. Later that evening, he received another text, this one from a cousin he hadn't spoken to in months. "Hey, man, I don't know what's going on, but they're telling everyone you flipped out. Said you threatened to cut them off financially as punishment. I just thought you should know." He didn't respond. Instead, he walked to the small closet Nora had cleared out for him and pulled down a worn blue folder. Inside were papers he had kept in no particular order, until now. He laid them out across the coffee table and began to organize them. Utility bills in his name, bank statements showing mortgage payments withdrawn from his account, receipts for home repairs, text messages from Louise asking for money just until next week, which he never got back. Each piece of paper told a part of the truth. Not the truth they were selling to the town, the truth he had lived. The repairs, the late-night runs, the days he'd worked double shifts to keep the lights on in a house that never felt like home. A spreadsheet Louise had once emailed him with the subject line, "Urgent House Budget," listed totals he had paid out of his own account, never once reimbursed. He found the email thread, scrolled to the bottom, and read his own response. "I got it covered. Just make sure you're okay." It made his stomach churn. By midnight, he had arranged the papers into a timeline. He wasn't sure why, not yet. It wasn't revenge he wanted. It was clarity, a record, proof that he wasn't what they were saying. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Louise. "I don't understand what's happening. Please, talk to us." He stared at the words. The same fingers that had once typed out late-night updates from the ER when his father had fallen and broken his wrist now hovered, unmoving. The words felt wrong now, like they came from someone playing the role of a mother without remembering the script. He deleted the message. The next morning, More notifications flooded in. Neighbors, church members, old teachers, all reacting to the post. Some had shared their own stories in the comments. I always thought Marcus was the one holding that house together. Another wrote, didn't he pay for their car repairs a few years back? The tide was shifting. Slowly, unevenly, but it was shifting. He received another text from a former co-worker. Your dad's ranting at the grocery store, said you ruined his life, but people are starting to ask questions. Nora came home to find him still at the table, the documents neatly stacked now. She set down her bag and said nothing, just looked at him. They're not trying to fix anything, he said, finally breaking the silence. They're trying to control the narrative. You gonna let them? She asked, voice calm. He shook his head. Good, she said, then keep going. He spent the rest of the day printing, scanning, uploading. He made copies of everything, set up a folder in the cloud, made notes, built a paper trail, because this time, when the story got told, it would be told right, and not by them. It was almost dawn again when Marcus finally leaned back from the table, his eyes dry and stinging from hours of reading, sorting, highlighting, and scanning. The apartment was quiet. Nora had gone to bed hours earlier, but not before setting down a plate of reheated lasagna beside him and gently placing her hand on his shoulder in silent encouragement. He hadn't touched the food, too absorbed in the task. The coffee in his mug had gone cold, untouched, and the soft humming of the refrigerator now sounded like a kind of metronome, keeping time with the rhythm of his resolve. The folder he had assembled over the past 2 days was no longer just a scattered pile of bank statements and bills. It had become a living document, a timeline, a map of the years he had sacrificed without recognition. Every receipt bore his name. Every online confirmation had his email. The paper trail was not just evidence, it was a biography, one they had tried to erase. And now, finally, he was ready to speak. He didn't sleep. As the early morning light stretched across the windowsill, Marcus opened his laptop and created a post. He didn't write with rage. There were no insults, no bitterness leaking through the sentences. He didn't need to scream to be heard. He needed only the truth, presented plainly. He started at the beginning. For years, I lived at home because I was told we were a family who took care of each other. When my parents fell behind on bills, I stepped in. I paid the electric bill every month for 4 years. The water, too. The gas. When the roof leaked, I patched it. When the car broke down, I paid for the repairs. When we were behind on the mortgage, I covered it, sometimes the full amount. I didn't do it because I was asked. I did it because I believed that's what family meant. What I didn't realize was that for them, family meant control. It meant guilt. It meant silence. On my 30th birthday, I came home late from work with a small cake I bought for myself. I wasn't expecting a party, but I didn't expect to be told to leave. No warning, no conversation, just a packed bag and the words, "You're too old to freeload." I had paid the bills, I had kept the lights on, I didn't scream, I didn't fight, I left, and I took my name with me. Now they are telling a different story, that I abandoned them, that I left them cold and starving, that I'm a selfish son who walked away from the people who raised him. So I am sharing the truth. Under that, he uploaded scanned copies of utility bills in his name, dated, organized, some with highlighted annotations. Then screenshots of bank transfers that covered mortgage payments. Photos of home repairs. His own ladder leaned against the siding, shingles stacked beside him, tools in hand. Screenshots of text messages from Louise asking for help with groceries, with medications, with overdue credit card balances. He didn't include a single opinion, just facts. At the bottom of the post, he wrote, "They did and didn't just lose a son that night. They lost the person who held their world together quietly for years." Then he hit post. He closed the laptop, unsure what to feel. A strange emptiness settled in his chest, like exhaling after holding his breath too long. He didn't expect anything to happen immediately. He didn't expect the town to believe him overnight. But at least now the truth was out. He finally slept. When he woke, the world had changed. Nora was standing in the doorway of the small living room, holding her phone with an expression halfway between disbelief and satisfaction. She met his eyes and said, "You might want to see this." His post had gone viral, at least by Ridgeway standards. Over 200 shares, hundreds of comments, dozens of private messages. A neighbor wrote, "I remember seeing him shovel their entire driveway after a snowstorm, alone. His dad just stood on the porch yelling." A former teacher commented, "Marcus was always responsible, even in high school. I remember he missed prom because he was working to help his parents with bills." Someone else posted a story about seeing Marcus carry 3 bags of groceries up the porch steps while Walter sat in his recliner, shouting at a football game. The town, it seemed, had always seen more than it let on. It didn't take long for the backlash to reach his parents. That afternoon, Walter posted again. This time, the tone was different. Families go through misunderstandings. What's important is forgiveness. My son is choosing to share private things publicly. It's sad. We just want to move on and be a family again. But the comments didn't buy it. One person wrote, "Funny how you never mentioned him paying your mortgage until now." Another added, "He has receipts. You have what? A porch photo and a prayer?" The support came from unexpected places. One of Marcus's old co-workers from the auto shop shared the post, adding, "This man skipped lunches for weeks so he could pay for his mom's tires. If you think he's lying, you don't know him." Messages continued pouring in. Some were quiet notes of solidarity. Others were confessions of similar experiences. Siblings who had been used, children who had been guilted, people who had walked away and never spoken about it. Marcus read each one. Some made him cry. Some made him angry, but mostly they made him feel seen. For the first time in a long time, the shame that had lived quietly inside him began to recede. Later that night, Louise left a voicemail. Her voice was soft, rehearsed, lined with desperation. "Marcus, honey, I didn't know your father was going to post those things. This is all a misunderstanding. Can we please talk? Please call me back. I know things can be fixed." He listened without emotion, then deleted the message. Not long after, another text came from Walter. "You think you won? Family always gets the last word." Marcus stared at it, thumb hovering over the screen. Then he blocked the number. Nora made spaghetti for dinner that night. They ate on the couch, plates in their laps. The TV played quietly in the background, but neither of them paid attention to it. She raised her fork in a small toast. To survival. He raised his own. To never apologizing for saving yourself. After she went to bed, Marcus sat by the window, looking out at the town that had once felt like a cage. The street lights flickered softly. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed. Life outside continued as usual. But inside him, everything had shifted. He didn't feel victorious. This wasn't a win. This was survival. This was truth, finally spoken aloud, no longer caged inside him like a wound no one could see. And though there were more battles ahead, he could feel them waiting. He knew one thing for certain. They would never again get to control the story. It belonged to him now. The air in the apartment felt heavier the morning the envelope arrived. It came not with a dramatic knock, not with a demand or a threat shouted through the door, but with a quiet, almost embarrassed rapping. Marcus had been sipping coffee by the kitchen window when he heard it. 3 soft taps, followed by the sound of shoes shifting on the hallway carpet. When he opened the door, the man waiting outside was dressed in a gray uniform, his face unreadable. He held a manila envelope in his gloved hand. Marcus Deshawn Harris? Yes, Marcus answered, though his voice caught slightly in his throat. The man extended the envelope. You've been served. Marcus took it, his fingers tingling where they brushed the edge. The man gave a curt nod, then turned and left without another word. The hallway was silent again. For a long moment, Marcus stood there staring at the envelope. It felt heavier than paper, as if the weight of everything his parents hadn't said, everything they had accused him of in whispers and social media posts, had been distilled into a few pages of legal language. He closed the door quietly and sat at the small dining table, hands resting on the unopened envelope. He knew who it was from. He didn't have to see the return address. When he finally opened it, the language inside was as expected. Formal, sharp, dressed in legalese that tried to wrap cruelty in process. The suit alleged that Marcus had committed financial abandonment, emotional abuse, and even theft. Theft. They had accused him of stealing from the very people he had supported for nearly a decade. There were phrases like willful neglect, failure to fulfill familial obligation, and infliction of emotional distress. For a moment, the old voice inside him stirred, the one that had always said maybe he was too cold, maybe too distant. Maybe he could have done more. It rose up like a specter, whispering its doubt. But Marcus had lived through too many quiet sacrifices, had seen too many unspoken debts chalked up as his duty. He pushed the voice down. He stood, reached for the blue folder he had built meticulously over the past few days, and set it beside the envelope like a rebuttal. He didn't yell. He didn't pace. Instead, he picked up his phone and searched for the number Nora had saved in his contacts earlier that week. Legal Aid, Columbus office. When the call connected, he explained everything as calmly and clearly as he could. He outlined the financial trail, the years of support, the accusations, the retaliation for his refusal to continue bearing the load. The woman on the other end of the line asked questions, sharp and deliberate. She didn't express shock, only determination. When he finished speaking, she paused before saying, "You have a very strong case. If they proceed with this, we'll support a countersuit." He thanked her and hung up. Later that afternoon, he filed the necessary paperwork. His countersuit outlined emotional and financial exploitation, misappropriation of his wages through manipulation, and a sustained pattern of coercive dependence that had spanned most of his adult life. It wasn't revenge, it was restoration. The documents he submitted didn't cry for pity. They proved a pattern. They proved truth. He remembered the first time Louise had suggested they open a joint account just in case. He had been 23. He was still working late shifts at the garage, scraping money together for a down payment on a used car. At the time, it had sounded reasonable. A safety net. A way to help. But as the years wore on, it became clear that the account wasn't a net. It was a leash. When the official date was set for the meeting between both parties and law enforcement representatives, Marcus was told he could bring someone for support. Nora came without hesitation. She didn't dress up for the moment, just jeans, boots, and the same quiet fire in her eyes that had always made Marcus feel like she saw him even when he barely saw himself. The station was unremarkable, square and bland, the walls painted the color of old printer paper. But when he stepped inside, envelope in hand, it felt like a line had been drawn in the dust. Walter and Louise were already seated at a worn wooden table in the interview room. Walter's face was tight with restrained fury. Louise looked older than he remembered, her hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes red-rimmed but dry. The officer introduced himself with professional detachment and explained the nature of the meeting. They would review the complaint. Marcus would respond with evidence. Both sides would have the opportunity to clarify statements before the next steps were decided. Walter barely let the officer finish before launching into his prepared tirade. "He abandoned us," Walter said, his voice rising. "We're elderly. We needed support. He disappeared and then turned the town against us with lies." Louise sniffled but said nothing. The officer nodded, then turned to Marcus. "Your response?" Marcus opened the blue folder and began to speak, calmly, clearly. Each document was placed on the table one by one. Electricity bills with his name and account number, monthly mortgage transfers from his account, screenshots of texts requesting money, photos of him repairing the house, time-stamped. His voice never shook. His hands never trembled. The room grew quieter with each piece of evidence. When he was finished, the officer leaned back and folded his arms. "Based on the documents provided, it appears Mr. Harris has contributed substantially to the household for years. The financial abandonment claim lacks standing. In fact," he looked pointedly at Walter and Louise, "there is a potential for counter-litigation if these false claims continue. Defamation, financial abuse, coercion." Walter's face turned red. "This is a witch hunt." Louise finally spoke, her voice breaking. "We didn't mean to hurt him. We were just scared." "Scared of what?" the officer asked. She faltered. "Of being alone, of losing everything." Marcus met her eyes for the first time. There was no hatred in his gaze, only weariness. "I didn't leave you," he said, voice low but firm. "You pushed me out. I just stopped paying the price." They left the station in silence. Walter's anger burned in his glare as he stormed past them without a word. Louise walked slower, her head bowed. Neither looked back. Outside, the autumn sky had turned a brilliant gold, the air sharp and alive. Nora placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder as they stood in the parking lot, watching the courthouse flag ripple in the breeze. "You did the right thing," she said. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." He nodded. That evening, he sat by the window of her apartment, the same one that had become a sanctuary in the middle of chaos, and watched the town settle into night. Porch lights blinked on, and wind scattered dry leaves across the sidewalk like confetti from a celebration no one had attended. He breathed deeply, not with triumph, but with release. He had spent years apologizing for wanting space, for asking for peace. He had begged silently to be seen not as a utility, but as a son. And now, at last, he had stopped begging. He hadn't destroyed his family, he had survived them. And, in doing so, he had finally begun to build something they could never touch, his own life, free and unsilenced. As the last light faded from the horizon, Marcus closed the curtain and walked into the room where his documents still sat in neat stacks. He didn't need to look at them tonight. The truth had already done what it was meant to do, and for once it was enough. The morning after the station meeting came quietly, with the first soft beams of light leaking between the blinds of Nora's apartment and stretching across the floor in long, warm stripes. Marcus sat at the edge of the futon that had become his bed for the past weeks, the hum of the city murmuring faintly through the open window. Traffic rolled slowly outside. Kids shouted to one another at the school bus stop down the street, and the smell of frying bacon drifted up from the unit below. The world had not changed, but inside him, something had shifted. There was no more fear when his phone buzzed, no twitch in his jaw at the sound of the word family, no hollow thudding in his chest every time he heard Louise's voice in his head, asking if he could cover one more thing, promising they'd make it up to him next month. That part of him, tired, overgiven, half-silent, was gone, or at least fading. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot Nora had left for him before going to work and sat down at the kitchen table just as another notification flashed across the screen of his phone. He didn't rush to check it. He took a sip of coffee first, letting the bitterness settle on his tongue, then calmly turned the phone over. A text from Louise. "After all we did for you, this is how you repay us. Your father's health is failing. He hasn't eaten in 2 days." Marcus stared at the message for a long time, reading it again and again, his thumb hovering over the screen. It wasn't grief that stirred inside him, it wasn't guilt. Not even anger, really. It was something colder, clearer, a weariness that reached deep into his bones. He didn't respond. Instead, he placed the phone face down on the table and stood. The time for explaining himself had passed. If they were starving now, it was not because he had left, it was because they had never learned how to stand on their own 2 feet. Because they had used his strength as their crutch for so long they'd forgotten how to carry themselves. The days that followed moved in a strange rhythm. They were filled with small acts, mundane, ordinary, but drenched in meaning. He reorganized Nora's bookshelf one morning while she was at the clinic, just to have something to do. He scrubbed the bathroom until the tiles gleamed. He drafted new versions of his resume, updated his certifications, and sent out applications to mechanics shops in towns within driving distance. He bought groceries once, alone, paying for his own items with a card that had no connection to anyone else. Every action was a statement, a piece of himself reclaimed. But still, the noise came. Calls from relatives he hadn't spoken to in years began to trickle in. Voicemails laced with disappointment, disbelief, thinly veiled manipulation. "You know your father's heart isn't strong," Aunt Marlene said on one recording. "You might not have much time left with him." "This is cruel, Marcus," came another message from his Uncle Phil. "Families fight, that's normal. But cutting people off like this, that's not you." They weren't calls of concern for his well-being. No one asked how he was, where he was staying, if he was eating, sleeping, surviving. They were calls meant to bend him, pull him, guilt him back into the cage he had broken free from. Then came the text from Tyler. "Dad told Mom to fake chest pains next if guilt tripping doesn't work. I'm sorry." Marcus read it 3 times before setting the phone aside again. The air in the apartment felt thinner then, like something poisonous had been confirmed. There was no sincerity left in the old house, only strategy, only pressure. That night, he didn't bother responding to anyone. He didn't pick up when Louise called. He didn't read Walter's next round of insults. Instead, he curled into the corner of the futon and let the silence settle around him. For once, he didn't resist it. He let the weight of the past years press down, but not to crush him, to remind him what he was leaving behind. It wasn't just exhaustion anymore. It was clarity. When Nora returned from work that evening, she found Marcus sitting quietly with the folder in his lap. He didn't look up when she walked in. "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft. He nodded once, slowly. "Yeah, I think I finally am." She didn't say anything else, just smiled and went to change out of her scrubs. After she disappeared into the bedroom, Marcus picked up his phone again and began scrolling through his contacts. Slowly, one by one, he deleted every number tied to that house. Walter, Louise, Aunt Marlene, Uncle Phil, even cousins who had reached out not to support him, but to scold him. He didn't cry. He didn't shake. He simply erased. Then, with quiet resolve, he opened his settings and blocked each number, ensuring they couldn't reach him again. It wasn't anger that moved his fingers. It was mercy. For himself. When he was done, he placed the phone face down again and leaned back in the chair, breathing deeply. It was the first time in years that he didn't feel a phantom pull, didn't imagine a fire waiting back at the old house for him to put out. No bills to cover, no emotional mess to clean up, no strings. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. He wasn't naive enough to think cutting them off meant the end of struggle, but tonight he had won a small, private battle. And it was enough. The next few days unfolded like pages of a quiet, unwritten chapter. He helped Nora reorganize her apartment, built new shelving for the entryway, repotted the dying plant by the windowsill. He continued sending out job applications, following up with potential employers, even speaking to the owner of a small garage outside of town who said he might have something open by the end of the month. But peace, it seemed, was a fragile thing. One Thursday morning, just as the crisp air of mid-October began to creep through the cracks in the window frame, his phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a call or a voicemail. It was a message from Carrie, an old coworker from the shop he had left earlier that year. "Hey, you seen what your dad posted?" Marcus's stomach turned before he even tapped the link. The post had been uploaded to the Ridgeway Community Bulletin again, but this time it was worse. No photos, just raw text, long and bitter. "Some sons are raised to be grateful. Some grow into snakes. After everything we gave, our son left us cold, sick, starving, and alone. No loyalty, no heart, just entitlement. Pray for us." The post already had over 100 comments. He scrolled slowly. "Disgusting," one read. "How can someone do that to their own parents?" Another said, "This generation is so selfish." Someone had written, "I always knew there was something off about him. Always so quiet." He nearly dropped the phone. Nora, standing in the kitchen with a bowl of cereal in hand, glanced over and saw his face. Her brows furrowed. "Bad?" He nodded. "Show me." He handed her the phone. She read in silence, her jaw tightening. Then, calmly, she placed the phone on the table and said, "They're writing your story for you again. Are you really going to let them?" He stared at her. Her words sank deeper than she probably knew. He thought of the folder, the scans, the records, the posts he had made. He had tried to walk away. He had tried to survive quietly. But maybe silence wasn't enough anymore. He didn't respond to the post, not right away. He didn't type a furious reply or rush to defend himself. He didn't send messages to anyone begging for them to believe him. Instead, he opened the drawer where he had placed the folder of truth and began scanning again. This time, he organized everything by date. He gathered more. Screenshots of old emails, statements from his job showing wage garnishments he had absorbed to keep the mortgage afloat, bank alerts showing overdrafts that happened because he'd bought medicine for Louise instead of buying groceries for himself. It wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. Clean, clinical, undeniable. He didn't post it yet. He waited. Because he knew now what they didn't. He didn't have to rush. He didn't have to scream. All he had to do was wait for the moment when their story collapsed under the weight of their own lies. When that crack came, he'd be ready, and the truth would stand, quiet and patient. That night, as he and Nora ate leftover spaghetti on the couch, she raised her fork in another toast. To survival. He smiled faintly, lifting his own. To never apologizing for saving yourself. Later, lying in the quiet of the apartment, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, he whispered something into the stillness that he hadn't dared to believe until now. I am enough. And in that whisper, he felt a future beginning, one he would write for himself, on his own terms. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out the next video and explore the others on the channel. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share it with them.